Well, hello and welcome to the latest installment in our ongoing series, PPE in a Time of Pandemic. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professors Lisa Herzog of the University of Groningen and Brian Berkey from the University of Pennsylvania. Today, we're going to talk about vaccine distribution and justice. Let's get started. First question, I'm gonna go to you, Lisa. So Lisa, in a recent publication, you and your co-authors have argued against the COVAX facility's recommended plan for vaccine distribution. So can you tell us more about the COVAX arrangement and what their recommendation for vaccine distribution is?
So COVAX is an international alliance that tries to sign up as many countries as possible to buy vaccines together. And in general, this is a great thing. And I think there are many philosophical arguments to say that more vaccines should go to COVAX. But when it comes to the question of which principle of distribution they use, they have gone for a proportionality principle. So every country is supposed to get vaccines first for 3% of the population and then for 20%. And what we argue in the paper is that a vaccine is not the kind of good that you should distribute just according to proportionality. It should go to those countries that need it most, where you can save most lives. And therefore, you should have a needs-based principle in the distribution of COVAX. But of course, the greatest challenge is to get international cooperation on vaccine distribution going in the first place. So it's not anti-COVAX, it's more sort of once COVAX has vaccines, how should they be distributed?
So Lisa, you said that the COVAX facility, that the plan was to use some sort of proportional allocation, and you and your co-authors recommend that vaccines be distributed in a different way in accordance with what you call the fair priority model. So could you tell us what the fair priority model is and how it differs from proportional allocation and why we ought to prefer the fair priority model?
Yeah, so I was invited to be part of a group of 18 bioethicists, political philosophers, ethicists, broad range of people from different countries. And we discussed about this question of how, from a perspective of justice, you would actually allocate vaccines between countries. And that is a pretty specific kind of distribution problem for two reasons. One is it's a temporal issue because it's a question of priority. Hopefully, eventually, in the end, everyone will get it, but who goes first, which is not the usual pattern of distributive problems we have. And the second issue is that you want to have a just distribution of one particular resource against a background of a hugely unjust world where there are lots of background injustices. And one of the challenges we faced was how you can try to come up with principles that wouldn't somehow build certain background injustices into the model just because there are so many factors where you could get it wrong. And actually, one of the arguments that was put forward early in the pandemic was that every country should get first vaccination for all their medical staff. That sounds plausible, but that illustrates exactly that problem because richer countries have more medical staff, and that's not a good reason to privilege them in the vaccination priorities. And what we then try to do in the model is base it on very basic moral principles like harm reduction, priority for the least advantage, and so on. So pretty basic stuff, and then come up with a model of three phases, which in a nutshell says in the first phase, when you still have the pandemic in full run, as it were, you should send most vaccines to countries where you can reduce the additional mortality and morbidity through COVID most. In a second round, that continues to be a criterion, but you add social economic issues because countries are in so different conditions. So, for example, a lockdown has much worse implications for a poorer country. And then in the third round, you try to get all countries back to a pre-pandemic state. That's very roughly, but that's the basic idea here.
So Brian, let's bring you in here. The economist Tyler Cowen has recently argued in an op-ed piece that when it comes to vaccine distribution, he thinks fairness is overrated. So instead, he thinks we should just be more pragmatic about these matters. So we ought to distribute the vaccine, he thinks, in whatever way would save the most lives and restore the economy quickly. So for example, he thinks that maybe we should, for pragmatic reasons, first vaccinate influential celebrities like NBA players. I'm just curious, what do you think about this line of reasoning? Need there be a tension between fairness and efficiency in the way that Cowan is imagining?
I mean, so in some sense, there can be a tension between fairness and efficiency, but I think Cowan is kind of operating with a strange and implausible conception of what fairness requires, right? So, I mean, fairness requires kind of the fair, kind of prioritization of, people on the basis of morally relevant factors like who's worst off, who stands to kind of avoid the most harm, and things along these lines. And I mean, his example is something like we have 20,000 vaccines, there's 20,000 towns in America. So fairness would suggest giving one vaccine to each town, right? And that ignores, who's hardest hit, how many people are in each town. I mean, it's a strange kind of example that kind of exaggerates the possibility that there can be this tension. The example that he gives of the NBA players is interesting because his thought there seems to be, well, look, if you vaccinate the NBA players on TV and then everyone can see them like healthy and playing basketball, then one effect of that might be that a lot more people will be willing to get the vaccine, right? And that seems really important, but it's really important in part for long-term fairness considerations, right? What we want is to ensure that kind of everyone can avoid the harm that the pandemic threatens, that the virus threatens, and that we are able to do things like avoid the development of new variants that might be vaccine resistant, right? So all of the values that are in some sense in the background of the right account of fairness are just relevant here. And so he might be right that, vaccinating the NBA players on TV would be a good idea. And, even though it's something that we might not do if we were thinking just about, who's most at risk or who's most kind of disadvantaged by the kinds of background injustices that Lisa describes and should be prioritized. So I think there's kind of something that he's kind of onto potentially, but more generally, I think his conception of fairness is
if I could
not the one we
briefly come in as well. So we had a few cases in Europe of arguably unfair priorities, namely when there were some vaccines left in some places. I mean, I totally understand that you don't want to waste them, though you want to send them maybe to more doctors and teachers in that area. But what happened was that local politicians or clergymen, people from the church would just come along and by accident get vaccinated. And that led to quite a lot of public outreach. And I think it's not good for the general willingness to stick to the rules. So there's also something about the perception of the fairness of the process and how that has an implication on the overall management of the pandemic. So that's another effect that maybe run a bit counter to what Brian just described, although I agree, there are lots of possible avenues of how you would arrive at a roughly fair distribution and prioritization.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So, Lisa, turning back to you, the fair priority model that you were describing a couple minutes ago makes use of SAILs or SEYLLs, or standard expected years of life lost. It makes use of this sort of measure in its recommendations for how the vaccines ought to be allocated in the different steps in that model. And I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about this measure, what it is, and why you use it.
That's one of these cases where it's actually really important to be careful not to bake existing injustices into a model, because you could imagine that you have two countries with very different life expectancy. So in one country, people live up to 50 and another up to 80. And then if you just think about, how many lives can I save? And people in one country on average just turn 50 and then they die, then you would save less lives there. And then you would think, maybe send less vaccines there. So the standardized model or this measurement that we use, it's used in international health issues in general. It's not something we came up with, but it standardizes life expectancy across countries and thereby prevents letting in this injustice through the back door. And we also thought it would be pretty easy to calculate prioritization on this basis. Actually turns out that having, not me, but people from our group have spoken to various modelers, and at the moment the best data is just for numbers of deaths, and so that's what you need to use to approximate when you actually want to make some calculations about, well, which countries would you want to have first in the queue according to that idea.
Brian, let's bring you in here. So do you have thoughts about the correct way of measuring like the value of a life for the purposes of evaluating proposals for allocating scarce resources, like in the vaccine distribution case?
Yeah, so let me say a little bit about the sales criterion that Lisa and her colleagues advocate, and a little bit about how it kind of figures in the argument that they make. So I generally think this is the right kind of criterion to use for the reasons that Lisa describes. We don't want people to be denied similar access to vaccines just because they are disadvantaged by pre-existing injustices and life expectancy is, say, lower in their country. One interesting thing, I mean, maybe Lisa can comment on this in response. I mean, I actually wonder if one implication of the sales criterion is that, you know, if you have a country with high life expectancy and really good healthcare that's doing pretty well in the pandemic, where virtually everyone who's dying is dying at an age that's greater than the average global life expectancy, the kind of sales lost in that country will be virtually zero. And so they would be kind of at the very back of the line in terms of, I mean, they might get nothing for a long time in terms of vaccines on this model. Now, that's not obviously the wrong answer, but it's just kind of an interesting, I think, implication of the view. Here's one more thing to say about the argument. So in the paper, the authors suggest that they can be kind of fairly non-committal about the extent of permissible national partiality more generally, right? So the fair priority model is supposed to kind of not depend on the view that there's like a very limited degree at most of national partiality that's permissible, that kind of global justice requires, for example, something like equalization of life expectancy across countries. But I don't think that can quite work, right? So I think that the requirement to use sales rather than something closer to like dailies or qualies, which is just looks at the amount of life years that are actually lost by people, depends on thinking that the injustices in life expectancy in the that the inequalities in life expectancy in the background are actually unjust. Right? Because if they're not unjust, it does seem to me like there's reason to just go with something like dailies or qualies, or I mean, saving more life years is kind of independently important. It's just overridden when the background differences are unjust. If they're not unjust, then it seems like saving more life years is gonna be the thing to do. But anyway, I think it's the right answer because I think inequalities in life expectancy across borders are unjust, right? But I just think the argument requires commitment to that view.
That's correct. I'm not quite sure I got how exactly this hangs together with nationalism questions, but let me maybe say one more thing about a criticism that has been raised against the sale criterion, and that has to do with the first example that you gave about, if people would only die at 90 or something, that country would be pretty low on the list. And some people have criticized us for not giving every life that might potentially be lost the same weight, because our criterion implies, when someone dies at 40, that's worse than when someone dies at 80. I would say this is defensible, and the question then is why. And I mean, from a utilitarian or consequentialist perspective, that seems pretty straightforward. I would say there's also a sort of contractualist, maybe even the deontological logic here, namely something like, behind a veil of ignorance, you would actually prefer people to have a kind of, full cycle of a life. I think there's something to this idea that there are certain things in life that happen at certain ages, and when you die earlier, it is actually worse than when you die at an age where you had a chance to realize many of these different values. But it remains controversial because some people say it's in contradiction with equal treatment of all individuals. So that's, yeah.
Brian, next question's for you. You have some recent work on the effective altruism movement. So can you tell us a bit more about what this movement is, and in particular, what you take its core philosophical commitments to be?
Yeah, so effective altruism is kind of a movement that kind of aims to encourage people to direct resources, broadly understood, including money, time, and so on, in ways that will do the most good to improve the world. And the focus among effective altruists tends to be kind of in three areas. The first is global poverty. The second is animal welfare, in particular, reducing the suffering of factory farmed animals. And the third, and kind of more recent area that has kind of gained attention, is the long-term future, things like avoiding existential risks from things like AI, also environmental destruction and things along these lines. So I think the core philosophical commitments include first a commitment to the idea that individuals' interests matter and matter equally, and that has to kind of figure in some important way in our moral decision making. And that doesn't require a kind of thoroughly utilitarian outlook, as kind of some critics argue. Can be kind of more ecumenical than that, but it does take kind of individuals' interests to matter directly for our decision making in a way that we who are kind of advocates of effective altruism worry that some other views can't accommodate. Second, there's a commitment to what I've called evidence-based decision-making. So gathering as much information as we kind of can cost-effectively, and kind of using that information, things like randomized control trials of interventions to deal with problems of global poverty, global health, animal welfare, and so on, and kind of making sure that our decisions are kind of as informed as they can be by this information, right? So that one of the things that effective altruist organizations do is try and kind of put all of this information kind of, on their websites or, kind of in places that are available to people, and kind of condense it down so that it's kind of digestible in, a reasonable period of time by non-experts, so that they can, make choices in a way that's at least more informed than many people do when they're doing things like giving money to charities. I think that's at least a rough overview of the central ideas.
Now, Lisa, you've also written about effective altruism, and you've argued that the movement has a picture of the social world and institutions that is importantly flawed. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about that criticism that you make.
Yeah, I should say, first of all, that I share many of the basic commitments of effective altruism. And I think the common enemy, if you like, is people who think that morality is not very demanding and it's okay to just go along, live your life, not care about other people, the environment, whatever. I think there we are really on the same page. And let me also say that I think effective altruism has evolved somewhat over time, but especially in some of the early contributions, it was a very atomistic picture of human nature, and it was a very optimistic picture with regard to how we can compare different options and what we can know about them, where I think the kinds of epistemological processes you need to assess this are far more complicated. And it did not really look at institutions very much. It was very much, what can I as an individual do to give money and to somehow help others out of poverty, But for sustainable solutions, I think we need to change social institutions. The problem is that this is incredibly hard. It can never be done by one single individual, but we can all make contributions to that. We can, be very conscious about what politicians to vote for, what causes to engage for. Insofar as we have some kind of, public voice, we can get ideas about changes in the world out there. I'm now in a position to also, sometimes talk publicly about institutional changes and these kinds of things. And I think, that's something that's at least as important as the kind of individual. Yeah, I mean, the sort of a very negative way of putting it, and I think it's too negative, it would be sort of a Band-Aid approach. Let's try to fix the worst pleading instead of looking for the underlying causes of the symptom. And when you think about the underlying causes, you get to really difficult questions about the global economic system, the lack of regulation in financial markets, the way in which the legal systems in many countries fail to protect, for example, sweatshop workers. And then, of course, it becomes all the more difficult to think about, okay, what can I do as an individual? But I think it's something that one should think about, and that one should keep being irritated about in a way, and think about, okay, what could we do? Where could I join some political movement, some social movements? And interestingly, I think many of the NGOs or charities that effective altruists also think are quite effective, they also do both. They do advocacy, they do direct help. So in that sense, it's sort of a criticism about strategy and about the account of institutions, human nature, what kind of causal processes should we try to take into account, while I share many of the basic normative values.
Brian, let me just give you an opportunity to respond here.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Lisa has said. In particular, I think, one thing that's really important is that, as she said, the common enemy is people who think that, we're morally permitted to not, do much about these sorts of problems that effective altruists are worried about at all. And she's kind of helpfully clear that the kind of demandingness that effective altruists often insist on is not the thing that's kind of objectionable about it. I also think it's right that we should be thinking about the more systemic questions. I mean, we should be thinking about kind of what global justice requires, how global institutions work, ways that they could be changed that would make things better, that would get at what some people call the root causes of things like poverty and so on. But the thing about it is, it's not just that none of us as an individual kind of has the ability to change global institutions. I mean, even all of the effective altruists in the world, plus all of their kind of left-wing institutional critics put together, working together, probably couldn't do a whole lot currently to change these global institutional structures. I mean, that's unfortunate, and I don't want to kind of be too pessimistic about this. One thing that can be done is work over time to kind of build a bigger movement, so that you bring enough people on board that enough people in kind of positions of influence, hopefully, on board, that we can make a difference to these things. Ask any effective altruist, if you had in front of you the change global institutions in a more progressive direction button, or the, all the rich people give their money against malaria button, right? Everyone's going to push the first button, right? But, even all together, we probably don't have access to that button right now. And so advocating that perhaps alongside engaging in political efforts, organizing efforts, and so on, we also do things like, if we're well off, commit to giving 10% of our income in ways that are proven to improve people's lives who are disadvantaged because of the injustice of these global institutions, is something that I think we should all be in favor of, and hope that people will get on board with.
Brian, switching gears somewhat here, you have a paper called Obligations of Productive Justice, Individual or Institutional. And in that paper, you argue that individuals can be obligated to voluntarily perform the work that's necessary for producing certain basic goods and services. So do you think in the face of a pandemic that individuals might be morally required to take certain jobs, like become a contract tracer, for example, and to take these jobs for the good of the collective? And if so, could you explain why and what your position is here?
Yeah, so here's the basic argument that I make in this paper. There are certain goods and services that everyone is entitled to as a matter of justice. So think about basic healthcare, for example. Right? We think that it's unjust if some people lack access to basic healthcare services. Right? Well, notice that in order for people to have access to basic healthcare services, some people have to perform the work that's necessary to provide those services. Some people have to be doctors and nurses and take other jobs in the medical field to ensure that these services are provided. Those who think that satisfying requirements of justice is kind of fundamentally only a responsibility of institutions, have to say that there's some set of institutional policies that's such that if they're adopted, it's guaranteed that those requirements are met, and so the relevant work will be performed. But I think there's no set of policies that's such that if they're adopted, it's guaranteed that those requirements will be met. Why is that? Well, take the policies that people who have this view will tend to advocate, things like providing economic incentives for people to go into certain fields of work. Well, citizens could always just decide, look, even though I could make a lot more money doing this, I don't want to be a doctor in rural Mississippi. I'm going to, be a lawyer in New York City instead. And if enough people refuse those incentives, then you might not have enough people who are willing freely to perform that work, right? So some people say then, oh, well, we should have compulsory service requirements, right? Everyone who graduates from medical school should just be kind of required by the government to go and spend a year or 2 years working in an underserved area. The problem with that is that might be a big deterrent against people entering medical school in the first place, right? People might not want to go and spend 2 years working in rural Mississippi. They might say, oh, I'm going to go to law school instead, where I'm not going to be made to do this. Right? So then it looks like the institutional option is something like forcing people to go to medical school against their will, and then imposing these compulsory service requirements. But I think that would be unjust. I don't think the government can legitimately force people to go to medical school against their will. And so the result is there's some work that's such that there's no set of policies that can guarantee that it gets done, and yet it's a requirement of justice that it get done. And what this means, on my view, is individuals are obligated to contribute to ensuring that this work is performed. I haven't quite worked out all the details of, exactly what the principles are that determine the contributions that each individual is required to make, but we can kind of start with a kind of minimum, fair share type view, right? Everyone is obligated to contribute in some way or other. It doesn't have to be by doing some of this work, but perhaps paying enough in taxes to make it possible for other people to do it, or incentivizing it in some other way. But when it comes down to it, we all have to kind of think carefully about what our kind of share of these obligations looks like, and what we're kind of positioned to do to contribute in relevant ways. And so I do think, for example, in a pandemic situation where we might need people as contact tracers, kind of as a matter of justice, that this is something that we're all obligated to at least think about and kind of take into account as kind of a morally relevant feature of the decision that we might make about whether to take up this sort of job or not.
So Lisa, bringing things back to you and back to the fair priority model. So one implication of the fair priority model is that high income countries, especially those like Australia and New Zealand, who've done an excellent job of controlling the spread of the virus in their countries will receive less of the vaccine than they would on the proportional allocation proposal, if I'm understanding it correctly. And then there are two different potential worries about this. So the first has to do with fairness. So it might seem unfair, or almost like an unfair punishment for countries like Australia and New Zealand, who often through great sacrifice responded very responsibly to the virus, for those countries to be deprioritized in this way. And then the second worry is a more just pragmatic worry. The worry is like, wouldn't the fair priority model remove one of the powerful incentives for these high income countries to participate in COVAX in the first place, if they're going to be deprioritized in this way?
Can I first briefly react to Brian's previous answer?
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
that okay?
Yeah.
Just to say that this is a sort of a very, there's a long tradition of Hegelian thought that is a lot about one's duty to find one's place in society where one will make one's contributions. And the way Hegel imagines ethical life is in a way a response to the effective altruist's challenge, how should I help? So Hegel thinks if we find the right set of institutions for him in a nation state, but we could imagine it on a global scale, then each of us can sort of find their place in the structure, and there will be enough to do, morally speaking, from that particular perspective. So that's a very interesting move, the sort of between individuals and institutions, and in the end we always need two. But now to your question about the fair priority model, it is one of the challenges, how to deal with potentially unfair treatment of countries that have worked very hard to try to get the case numbers down. I'm not quite sure whether it's so unfair that we should be extremely worried, because compared to what some other countries go through, even travel bans or quarantine after travel and all these things are still relatively mild. So I'm actually in a way more worried about the political, realpolitik kind of dimension here, which is incentives. And it has been an argument by COVAX that with this proportionality model, where every country gets a certain amount, they would attract more members. Now, there are two things that don't quite work here. One is that the richer countries all have bilateral deals with the companies that produce vaccines anyway. So they don't rely on the vaccines that they get through COVAX. That is another issue, to what extent that should have been allowed in the first place, but I'm not sure it could have been prevented. But at the moment, we have this coexistence of COVAX, and it tries to buy vaccines on the market, but then there's also all these bilateral deals. And that's how most rich countries get their vaccines. The other thing is that it might not be so irrational for a country, and hence there might be no disincentives to sign up for an imaginary COVAX that has a more needs-based approach, because it would resemble more a kind of insurance model where, if I don't have many cases, I'm later in the queue. But if I happen to have many cases, then I get, a place earlier in the queue. And in that sense, if you think about it as an insurance thing, that you bundle your risks together with the others, then it actually makes eminent sense to go for a more needs-based model in the distribution of vaccinations, and not just everyone gets the same proportion and so on.
Brian, here's a question for you about business ethics. So given that many jobs have become significantly more dangerous during the pandemic, do you think that businesses have some sort of moral obligation to compensate their workers for taking on risks beyond those that they likely agreed to in accepting the job in the first place?
Yeah, this is a good question. One thing to note is, early in the pandemic, a number of companies kind of announced that they were going to do this, right? They're going to pay their frontline workers, $2 more an hour or something like that. And then kind of slowly, a lot of these companies just kind of quietly phased out this sort of policy, even though, of course, we're still in the pandemic situation, a year later. I do think there are significant moral reasons for companies to do this. It's hard to kind of separate out different kind of factors that might be kind of affecting our intuitions here. I mean, one is just, certainly in the US, but I think probably in a lot of other countries too. I mean, there's just overwhelming reason to think that um, low wage workers are already paid objectionably little. And so kind of anything that would kind of lead employers to kind of pay them a bit more seems kind of called for a number of kind of overlapping reasons. But we can kind of think about this a little bit differently by just kind of imagining a starting point, pre-pandemic, that we just think is just, right? Okay, so workers are being paid such and such amount, CEOs are being paid such and such an amount that's much more than that, but maybe less than what they get paid in the actual world. And then the pandemic hits, and all of these lower wage workers are facing more dangerous conditions. They're putting themselves at risks in ways that they weren't before. And the executives are all kind of working from home. Not only are they not, dealing with the same risks, but they get to save on commuting costs. They get to avoid the hassle of commuting. They just get to kind of sit at home and do their work there. And so you've got kind of this kind of widening of a gap between the burdens of work for certain kinds of employees versus other kinds of employees. And it just seems obvious that justice calls for a response to this that kind of adjusts the distribution of the benefits of the relevant productive activity in light of this kind of unpredictable and to some extent kind of unavoidable shift in the risks. It's hard to see kind of a good moral basis for denying this, I think.
So thank you both. I'm now going to hand things over to Simone, who will be handling questions from our audience.
The first question that we have kind of invites reflection on some of the things that Lisa said a little earlier, so I'll pitch it to her. So Lisa, you mentioned some situations where the public reacted adversely to decisions about vaccine distribution. So to examples of politicians or clergy receiving the vaccine in early distribution. Now, Alex would like to know whether there has been any research into public perceptions of what fair distribution of vaccines would look like. And in particular, he'd like to know whether there'd been any research into or engagement with the public in the countries that stand to benefit most from COVAX.
I'm not aware of any. What I'm aware of is that in at least most European countries I know about, there have been sort of semi-public, semi-academic commissions that determine the priority. So, it was not like there was a big public involvement or, a kind of, you could have a deliberative mini public on these kind of things. That did not take place. There was a bit of representation of different voices from academia, I would say, and bioethicists were involved in this. And I think there were some surveys, but I would have to look for data now. And I mean, this is changing all the time about whether or not people in those countries that have some kind of prioritization think there should be one. And do you agree that over 85-year-olds should be vaccinated first? That type of question. I think that has taken place, but that is pretty specific to the different countries. I'm not aware of any systematic research that would prove what I conjectured, namely that people feel resentment and are less inclined to obey the rules if they perceive the vaccination prioritization as unjust. That's a hunch that I have, and anecdotal evidence of people being angry about this, but I haven't seen big public surveys.
So the next couple of questions that we have ask us to look beyond considerations of allocating vaccines or other medical goods fairly, and they ask whether priority should be given to people who find themselves in kind of special social situations. So Tom asks whether we should give special priority to people who are at higher risk as a result of how society is organized. And the example he gives is of giving priority to people who are imprisoned by the state. And Emily, in a similar vein, asks what the respondents would think about vaccine distribution to younger people in society who've had to give up a lot in the course of the pandemic, including the fulsome experience of university education in order to protect older citizens from harms. So I'll put that to both of you.
I think there are some arguments to be made I would say mostly because of risk assessments. And when it comes to younger people, for example, there have been some debates, and there have even been legal cases that I'm aware of younger people with previous health risks and how they would be treated. The mere fact that young people have given up certain experiences, there I would say, I don't think that's a reason to put them earlier in the vaccination queue. I think that's a reason for thinking about how other mechanisms of compensation could happen, like, maybe a year more at university or something like that. I think that there are other ways, because this in a way is not as irreplaceable as a life when someone actually dies. So I think it doesn't win over against the prioritization according to risk, because we still have lots of groups that are still, at a really high risk of actually dying when they catch COVID. For prisoners, I think there is a case to be made because they are in a really, really high risk situation. Same goes for refugees who live in some kind of shared accommodations. Berlin, the city of Berlin, has now started to vaccinate homeless people at a pretty high priority. So I think there are lots of arguments one can make, and it's very hard to, for example, prioritize between younger people with a pre-existing health condition and teachers who have some higher risk. But I would say that risk really should remain the main line of categorization here.
I agree with pretty much everything that Lisa just said. I mean, the case of prisoners, especially in a country like the US, is important and I think interesting because, we could make kind of a similar argument to kind of the ones that I was kind of alluding to in our earlier discussion, which is something like, they should get some degree of priority because the conditions that they're facing are so unjust, right? The conditions in a lot of prisons are, I think, quite unacceptable. I mean, the whole US criminal justice system, I think is kind of uncontroversially deeply unjust. And so the people who are kind of unjustly disadvantaged in virtue of the operation of that system have some claim to have additional risks that they face because, say the conditions in prison, even if they're justifiably imprisoned, are unjustly poor, to kind of have their interests, taken more seriously in virtue of that disadvantage. The issue of younger people missing out on certain experiences. I mean, I sort of agree with Lisa that can't, I think, provide reasons to give them priority over people who are at greater risk of dying or facing severe health consequences from getting COVID. But it does kind of raise some more general issues about the sorts of policies that ought to be adopted in the wake of the pandemic to perhaps compensate people who have faced significant negative consequences of this kind. And again, I mean, we might think like pretty systematically, younger people are, kind of unjustly disadvantaged in comparison with kind of older generations in societies. I mean, we've seen, kind of starting wages, kind of go down in purchasing power. Wealth is more and more concentrated in the hands of older generations than it was, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Opportunities are more limited, and then when young people kind of lose out even further and face further challenges in their economic lives because of the effects of the pandemic, I think that's something that kind of also calls for reflection on what sort of policies ought to be thought seriously about going forward.
Thank you. So the next question asks both speakers for their position on the possibility of private companies importing and distributing vaccines in their countries for their employees rather than waiting for a government to make a priority order. So this questioner would like to hear from both Brian and Lisa about that.
I mean, I guess my initial inclination is that in a world in which vaccine supplies are limited, it's objectionable for firms to kind of use their wealth and market power to gain priority access to this limited supply of very valuable resources for their employees. There's no particular moral reason why the employees of companies that kind of, for whatever reason, are able to, kind of gain access to these supplies should kind of get access before other people who might be needier. So this doesn't seem like something that we should think is morally permissible. I guess the policy questions about, whether this should be prohibited, whether the government should kind of step in and prevent this from happening are harder, but I don't see any moral case for thinking that this is acceptable.
Yeah, I think one could construct some hypothetical example where there might be a failure of public policy to take one particular risk group into account, and they all happen to work for one particular company or whatever. Maybe in such a case, it would be legitimate, but otherwise state provision is still the best chance, and it's not perfect, but it's the best chance of having some kind of orderly process. And again, the matter of perception is, I think, also really important here. And I mean, from purely prudential reasons, if I were in a company, I would advise against it, because the public perception might be pretty negative. So there are even just, purely instrumental reasons. But morally speaking, I fully agree with Brian here.
So Megan has a kind of pressing pragmatic question. So she writes, many countries have contributed to COVAX financially whilst prioritizing offering vaccines to their entire population. This latter commitment seems more politically expedient, yet it risks depleting the global vaccine stock that COVAX's success relies on. So in light of this, what is a pragmatic approach to actually convince governments to commit to equitably distributing their acquired vaccines?
That's the $1 million question at the moment. I mean, it is a matter of fact that we do have vaccine nationalism, and not even only the rich countries, also many sort of medium income countries are now trying to get bilateral deals. I think there are arguments one can make that the richer countries also have material reasons, self-interested reasons to want to make sure that all the world gets vaccinated as fastly as possible, because if other mutations of the virus arise elsewhere in the world where people have not yet been vaccinated, we don't know whether the vaccines we have would work against those. So a global pandemic needs to be fought on a global level. And so the hope would be that the richer countries would really, maybe with a bit delay, but as soon as any possible, also donate more money to COVAX. And then there is a very practical question about vaccine production. And I mean, people have discussed about open licensing of the patents that are at stake here. Some companies have said themselves that they would not enforce intellectual property rights on these. But from what I understand, what matters is much more proactive technical help in getting the production of these vaccines started in more countries by companies that might not have so much experience, but especially the more high-tech versions of this. Also, you might ask questions about whether, there could be a better allocation of those vaccines that require a cold chain for logistics to be sent to the Western countries that have these cold chains, and the others being sent primarily to other countries, because you cannot, cold chains in lots of countries of the world, just it wouldn't work. So there are lots of practical challenges here. And in the end, a lot of it is going to be a question of money. And I very much hope that the richer countries will recognize that it's not only an ethical duty, but even in their own interest. It's sort of overdetermined that you should really do it.
So I have a question for Brian from Parker. So Brian, you said that individuals might have an obligation to take on certain jobs in order to ensure that a sufficient amount of basic goods are produced. Now, offhand, this seems like a collective obligation. We all have an obligation to produce enough basic goods. How do you think collective obligations relate to individual ones? If we have an obligation to X, some of us need to do it in order to fulfill the obligation, but why me?
Great question. The issue of the relationship between collective and individual obligations, I find very difficult. There are a lot of people who've been kind of thinking about this in recent years. It's kind of a growing area of philosophical interest, and I don't have a fully worked out answer. I do think that it is easier to think about our individual obligations in cases where there's a collective obligation that applies to a group that we're clearly a part of, when the content of the collective obligation is something like achieving a certain state of affairs, right? So if we're collectively obligated to achieve a state of affairs in which, say, everyone has access to basic medical care, then surely my individual obligation, if I have one, is going to amount to kind of some contribution to promoting that state of affairs. And it's hard to figure out exactly what that might be. I mean, we can have a kind of fair share view, or a view on which we're obligated to take up the slack for the non-compliance of others, at least to some extent. So I think in the case that I described, it is like that, right? I mean, the content of the requirement is achieving a certain state of affairs. And so what we are obligated to do is going to be, contributing in some way toward the realization of the state of affairs, bringing us closer to it in morally relevant ways than we would otherwise be. But there are other cases where plausibly the content of the collective obligation is something else. And then it's, I think, even more challenging to kind of think through what exactly is my obligation. And of course, there are also cases in which the content of the obligation is bringing about some state of affairs, but it's a threshold case rather than a case where individual contributions can bring us closer. And those cases, I think, are, if anything, even harder than kind of any of the other cases, because we need to know a lot about what other people are likely to do in order to know whether it is reasonable for us to prioritize doing what might be our share if enough other people did their shares. These things get complicated very quickly, and again, I don't have a fully worked out view, but I do think the kind of case that I described, while not easy, is among the easier types of cases.
So Emily asks what the respondents think about vaccine refusal. And as a related issue, what do you think about issuing vaccine passports to all of the vaccinated population? So thereby providing them with greater rights and freedoms, while the unvaccinated are denied these things?
Tricky questions. I think the passport solution, it looks like it introduces all kinds of injustices. But in a situation where everyone has a chance to be vaccinated, and I don't mean like immediately, but in a reasonable time frame of 1 to 2 months, whatever. The way I think about it is the restrictions take away freedoms from individuals and it's a pretty massive interference with what they can do with their lives, like meet friends, go to events, whatever. And that needs to be justified. And if someone has been vaccinated, and if it's been proven, and it looks like this is the case, that vaccines also prevent transmission, then there is no good justification any longer for these restrictions. And in that sense, you then need a way of organizing the transition period in which some people have been vaccinated, others not. And then such a certificate or passport or whatever seems a pragmatic solution. So I don't think there's something fundamentally ethically wrong with it. There are some sort of boundary questions about, if someone had actually, the disease and they are maybe also already immunized, how does that count and so on. But I think those are sort of they are not sufficiently weighty to overrun the general principle. Vaccine refusal, I think, a lot can be done in terms of public outreach, explaining personal encounters with medical stuff that explains these things. So, countering the fake news side of things and so on, that's definitely very important. What I'm not so sure about is whether it should be made mandatory in any way. I mean, it was a bit discussed here whether it should be made mandatory for care staff, and especially homes for the elderly. But I think it would be problematic, especially because these people have been quite unfairly overburdened by all they had to go through during the pandemic, the additional measures, the restrictions, everything. And there's a lot of frustration. They're also very badly paid and so on. So then forcing them to get vaccinated seems not the best strategy here. It seems just demanding too much from one particular group, especially given that you can also vaccinate the patients, and thereby you also.
Sorry, I think we just had an internet issue there.
Yeah.
Brian, did you want to respond?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. So, I'm generally in favor of something like vaccine certificates. I think Lisa's right that there are worries about, equal access, right? I mean, we don't want to end up with a situation in which, we have these vaccine passports or something to be able to do a whole bunch of things. And, some people are kind of unjustly denied the opportunity to get vaccinated or get the passport or something like that. But I think it's going to be necessary in order to allow people to be able to start doing all of the things that we're all eager to start doing again. And I think on vaccine refusal, I'm probably a little bit more kind of in favor of making vaccination mandatory than Lisa was suggesting. Given what's at stake for everybody, it seems like this is a relatively minor kind of infringement of liberty, given the risks. We, of course, people who can't get vaccinated for medical reasons should be exempt and so on. But, I'm just struck by, I was just reading an article, they did a survey in Colorado, and 29% of white Republicans in Colorado said that they intended to get vaccinated.
Okay, I was not assuming these kinds of numbers. I was assuming that you would reach herd immunity with volunteers. So yeah, that changes the picture.
I mean, I'm not persuaded that in the US at least we'll get to herd immunity through people just voluntarily getting vaccinated. I mean, we'll see in a few months kind of where we end up once everyone is provided with the opportunity to get vaccinated. But I am worried that we may wind up in a situation in which we just don't have enough people being willing to do it voluntarily. And that puts us all at risk. I mean, for all of the reasons that we've already talked about, the rise of variants and, that might be vaccine resistant and so on. And, we can't allow the world to just be in this kind of cycle of the situation that we're in for kind of years and years because a whole bunch of people are refusing to get vaccinated.
And on that slightly depressing note, I'm going to hand things back to Ryan.
This concludes today's PPE in a time of pandemic. Please join me in thanking our speakers today, and we hope that you join us for future iterations of PPE in a time of pandemic.